Hello, folks. Hi, Steve Blankard here again, and I want to talk today about Remington #2 sporting rifles. You know, most of my videos are out at the range shooting them, and you know these are some of my favorite rifles. And I think many of you know that I've been collecting and researching these for a while now. And I've gathered quite a bit of data. I've probably looked at least partially looked at over 150 of these rifles, maybe more, and I've been able to gather quite a bit of data, and I'm trying to put that data together to be able to help determine when the time frame that these rifles were made. Some of you may know that the Remington factory records are all but lost, so there's very little hard evidence of the manufacturing, when they were made, and the features and the documentation for it, and it makes it really hard to understand these rifles. And you know, a lot of people want to know when the rifle was made, and that's kind of got me going down this road of asking that same question. Now, I will say right off the bat, one of the best references, best source of information is this wonderful book by Roy Marcotte, Rolling Block Rifles, Carbines, and Sporting and Target Rifles. It's a fabulous book. There's a chapter on the #2 sporting rifles in here. And that really got me started. I got a lot of great information from this book, but it left me hungry for a lot more. There were so many questions that were left unanswered. So I looked at the rifles that I had, and I noticed a number of varying features on these rifles. And so I got wondering, well, why did this feature change? What's the differences? And I started looking at them, and the more I looked at them, the more I started seeing little differences in them. So I decided to embark on this research project about 2 years ago, starting to document the features and the serial numbers and try to kind of figure out at least a window of time, a rough window, perhaps by the decade, of when rifles were made based on their serial numbers. Now, Roy Marcotte in his book says that about 44,000 rifles, well, his total numbers are about 44 rifles were made. He mentions the number made from this, when Remington was, I know I'm going to jump around a little bit here, but when Remington went into bankruptcy in 1886, they emerged in 1888, and from that period forward, he discusses how many rifles were made, and he says overall about 44,000 rifles were made, total production, and that runs from 1872 to 1913. So that's a 41-year span, and about 44,000 rifles. So you know, if we average that, that comes to you know, a little over 1,000 rifles a year. But we know that really that you can't. That's not a hard and firm number. You can't, because production during the period when they first started up was slow. When they went into bankruptcy between '86 and '88, almost no rifles were produced, and then at the very end, those numbers tapered off considerably at the very end. So it's really hard to narrow it down. But what I've done is I've identified features and the serial numbers, and I've been able to identify common features of certain periods. Now, Remington, like many companies, used up whatever parts they had. So there was not a clear end of a certain feature, and then starting with the next serial number, every one thereafter had the next change. There was a lot of overlap, and I've seen this as I've looked at many rifles, that there may be a feature that came out early, and for the most part, after a certain point, you don't see it anymore, but then an occasional rifle did come up with that feature still. So whether they found some more parts back in a back storage building somewhere, somebody special ordered something unique on it, it's really hard to say. So there's a lot of speculation in what we have here. But today I want to show you, I got 5 of my rifles out here that can represent some of the kind of key changes in the evolution of these rifles. The first rifle, when we start at the beginning, the #2 sporting rifle that we know today evolved from the model 1871 Remington Army pistol. It uses that basic action, which was a pistol, and they just straightened out the Tang and made it into a mid-sized rifle action. It's really a sweet size. It's larger than the #4, smaller than the 1 or #1.5. So it's kind of that in between, just really a perfect size. But it evolved from that, and most of the parts will interchange from an 1871 Army pistol. But when they first came out with this rifle, it was developed in late 1872, and when it when they first announced it, in the very earliest advertising, it was called the Gem rifle, Gem, Gem rifle. It wasn't called the number 2 sporting rifle. And so the very earliest rifles, and I don't know, I can't say for sure how many, but at the first, I want to say the first few hundred rifles perhaps are considered gem rifles. And I think one of the identifying features that collectors tend to use, and I tend to agree as close as I can, is the markings. Now I want to show you this. We're going to bring the camera up and try to show you this. The very earliest rifles, the first couple hundred of these rifles, what we call the gem rifles, have the patent dates and the company name on the upper tang of the rifle. I'm going to show you that on this very first one. This is a gem rifle here, and hopefully you can see this is stamped on the tang. Like many of the number 1 military rifles, they're stamped on the tang, but this is only on the very first couple of hundred rifles that have it here. And then those markings were moved. And I think perhaps they moved them because they anticipated mounting a tang sight in here and they didn't want to cover those up. So in the transition, there is a very rare one, and this has the markings on the upper edge of the receiver, very similar to the model 1871 Army pistol markings, but it's not the same as the Army pistol markings. It's similar, but it's in the kind of the same location, but it's not the same stamping. This is the only rifle I've ever seen and even heard of that has the markings on this. And this exact rifle is referenced in Mr. Marcotte's book, and I was very fortunate to obtain this rifle last year. So I consider this is a transitional marking one that had this mark. And then from then on, they moved all the patent dates up to the left front edge of the receiver right here, and then the company name is all stamped in the barrel, and we'll talk about those in a minute. But let's going back now to the evolution of the rifle. So the gem rifle was what first came out it was mentioned in December of 1872 in advertising, and then sometime early in 73 they renamed it the number 2 sporting rifle, and that's the name that we know it as today. And there's no really physical difference between the gem and the number 2. It was just an advertising name. I guess they figured the gem name didn't quite catch on as well as they thought, and they wanted to be consistent with their number 1 military and sporting rifles that they were producing. So some of the evolutionary features of these, besides the markings, one of the first features that only lasted for a relatively short period of time, and I'm going to look at some of my notes here. First I'm going to talk about the extractor. The extractor on the earliest rifles, the gem and the early number 2 rifles, use what's called a knife blade extractor. And I want to show you that. You don't see these very often, but the extractor is just a slim little bar here. It's kind of similar to the bar extractor used on other bigger rifles, but it's kind of referred to as a knife blade because it's very thin. And this was used up to the first 2,000, maybe 2,500, I forget the exact number, some are rifles. But they found this knife blade extractor would rip through the copper rims of the early cartridges. Most of these guns are chambered in rimfire cartridges, and they were copper and they're pretty soft. And that knife blade would rip through the case if the cartridge was sticky in the chamber. So that knife blade was soon replaced with what we know as the more common, much larger sliding bar extractor that has a much more surface area here to grab the rim. And this is the extractor that was used throughout the remainder of production, and it works very, very well. So that was a pretty significant difference. I have shot one of these rifles with a knife blade extractor, and I can confirm that it does in fact not work very well. It is rather weak, and it's easy to slip past the rim also. So I want to talk about some of the other features. I've cataloged actually a lot of different things, and I'll just kind of run through a couple of these things. There's differences in the front sight. There's 2 different front sights. There are 4 different rear barrel sights. Also, what's called the rough and ready sight, which is a barrel sight that flips up. It's for an aperture sight. Some rifles are drilled and tapped for a Tang sight. Some aren't. Well, let's just talk about these a little bit. First off, let's talk about the front sights. The typical front sights, and these are very common. It's pretty typical of the sights that we see on these rifles. But there are 2 sizes of dovetails. There's a 15-30 seconds width dovetail that's mostly seen on the early ones, and then there's a 3/8 or 375 diameter dovetail that's like this one that is seen on the later ones. So that is initially most of the early rifles really have that larger dovetail, and then later on in production they started going more to the 3/8 dovetail in that front sight. But again, this is one of those things where it changed and it's not consistent, because through my research surveys, I've seen a number of late rifles that have that larger front sight base also. So again, it's a matter of using up what they had, I think. Now we talk about rear sights. Now rear sights, there are 4 different types of rear sights, and I'm going to ask my friendly neighborhood cameraman to come back in close again. So the earliest rear sight, this is the earliest style rear sight. I just call this the Type 1. And you can see the shape of it here is rather unique, very streamlined. It's almost octagonal shape to match the barrel shape. This is the Type 1 and used on the very earliest rifles. Let's see. This is what I call a Type 2 front sight. Notice this kind of arrowhead shape here. It's used for not a long period of time, and they evolved a bit too. This is what I call the Type 2. The Type 3 sight, oh, not that one, sorry. This is a Type 3 or Type 4 type sight, and the only difference between Type 3 and Type 4 is the size of the dovetail. Again, they have 2 different size dovetails. There was a 5/16 dovetail and a 3/8 dovetail. So the 5/16 seemed to come sooner, and then the 3/8 one, but again, it's not a clear cutoff, and I see both of them. But this shows you the different types of rear barrel sights that were typically used on these rifles over the whole period of production. Okay, so let's see, what else can we talk about? Tang sight, drilling and tapping. The early rifles were not drilled and tapped for a Tang sight unless it was a special order thing, because Tang sights weren't common back in the early days. But later on, when the factories started producing sporting Tang sights, and both Lyman and Marvell's were coming out with them, and they became more popular as target shooting evolved. They eventually started drilling and tapping all of them. But in the earlier days, probably at least up until the bankruptcy in 1886, it was rather optional. And from all the surveys that I've done, I've seen that where many of the are not drilled. And this is example 1 here. It's just smooth. The difference is there'll be another hole drilled right up in the front here for the Tang sight to mount. Now, well, this is one here that I have a gallery Tang sight on. Gallery Tang sight mounts with just a single screw up on the front here, but on the other sporting Tang sights, it would use both this hole and the front one. So identifying one that's been drilled and tapped, it will have a hole up at the front here. So that's, in the later ones, towards the end of production, I think they were all drilled that way, but some of the early rifles don't have that. Next up, okay, let's talk about the forend, 2 things on the stock. Now, the early rifles, but generally speaking, up until the time of the bankruptcy in 1886, all used the steel Schnabel forend cap here. This is steel, and they typically had the half moon cutouts on the stock here at the buttstock, and then ahead of the receiver on the forend here. That's the common features up until, and these are up until 1886. These are the E. Remington and Sons made rifles. And typically then after that, when it became Remington Arms Company in 1888, they did away with that for the most part, and they went to the ebony insert here on the forend. and they did away with the half moon shapes here on the fore end and the buttstock. It's just smooth there. So that's typical of the post 1888 rifles. So let's talk about the bankruptcy and changeover a little bit. Remington had, the post-war period, arms were very, they were flooding the market, and it was a lot of competition, and there were still millions of guns left over from the war. It was a tough time, and Remington had their difficulties as well. They eventually went into receivership in 1886, and they were purchased by Marcellus Hartley, who owned Marcellus Hartley and Graham, one of the largest military surplus dealers. And eventually he also owned UMC, and he actually got with the Winchester folks too, and together they purchased the assets of Remington, and in 1888 they reemerged as the Remington Arms Company. So the barrel markings reflect that. So let's talk about, let me jump down here. So we'll talk about the barrel markings when I'm on that subject. There are a total of, I want to say, 9 different variations of company markings on these rifles. Now, we already talked about the gem rifle having it on the Tang, and the transition rifle having it right up here on the side of the receiver. And then from that point on, patent dates are all up here on the side of the receiver, but the barrel stampings vary considerably. And there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 different barrel markings with the company name on them. And the variations, first up, well, when they were putting them on the barrel up until 1886, it's just E. Remington, E. Remington and Sons, Ilion, New York, on the top of the barrel. But sometimes they read to the muzzle, sometimes it's faced around reading to the breech, and then there's different fonts they used, and there's a mix. There's quite a mix of them. In 1888, when they emerged from bankruptcy, then the name changed to Remington Arms Company, and that's what's stamped on these barrels, from that point forward. And there are several variations. There are, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4 variations of the Remington Arms Company stamp on the barrel. And these are sort of linear. In other words, they sort of changed from my research, but there's a lot of overlap also. So it's not consistent. I think maybe it could have had to do with what chambering. Barrels chambered for a certain cartridge were hit with one stamp. Maybe for another cartridge they used a different stamp. I really don't know. I can't really explain that, but there are quite a few different ones. But there is a trend also, and I've identified these as basically the markings type 1s through type 9s, and in chronological order they generally follow that as a way I've identified them. Now the very last rifles, in 1911, UMC and Remington Arms Company combined to create the Remington UMC Company, Remington Union Metallic Arms Company. Union Metallic Cartridge Company, I should say, and they're stamped Remington Arms - Union Metallic Cartridge Company, Remington Works. That's probably started around 1912, and the end of production was in 1913. And by that time, they were making very few rifles. So that is a very rare one. I do not have one of those to show you. But if you ever see one, a number 2 rifle that is marked with Remington Arms and Union Metallic Cartridge Company, that is one of the very end of production. So it's quite a rarity. So that talks about the barrel markings. What else did I want to touch on? Well, there's variation in hammer spurs on the rimfire cartridge rifles. On these centerfire rifles. Centerfire rifles initially used the model 1871 Army breech block, and that's readily identifiable. And I don't have one laid out here to show you. I didn't think about bringing one out here, but it has a sighting notch because it's for a pistol. The top edge of the breech block right here has a little notch in it. It's a sighting notch. Well, it doesn't do any good in the rifle because you've got the barrel sights here, but it was used for the pistol as the rear sight for the pistol. But when they started chambering these in centerfire cartridges, they just used leftover 71 Army breech block that had that slot in it. Later on, they redesigned the breech block, and it no longer has that notch. The centerfire breech block is just rounded. The centerfire breech blocks are readily identifiable because they all have a firing pin retractor built into the base of the breech block. And that's a nice feature to have, to make sure that the pin retracts back, so when you slam the breech block closed, you're not potentially hitting the primer. Now, many of these rifles over the years have been converted, rimfire rifles have been converted to centerfire, and that's something that's really nice. These breech blocks are really simple, and they lend themselves to easily converting to centerfire. And I have a few of those. This is one here. This is a 44 caliber that's been converted to centerfire, and it's not hard to do. But these that are converted do not have that firing pin retractor on them. So if you're looking at a rifle and it's a centerfire one, well, one, you should see a plugged hole where the rimfire firing pin was at the 6 o'clock position, and two, it won't have that firing pin retractor mechanism in it. So, all right, so let's talk a little bit about chambering. So, again, so you're wondering, what everybody likes to know is, well, when was my rifle made? And, that's what drove me to starting this project. And I don't really have solid answers. I wish I could. But I've generally broken them down based on what I've found to roughly by decade, that I can be fairly confident when a rifle was made based on the features and the serial number. I'm fairly confident I can narrow it down to a decade that it was made. And there's a couple things that I use to do that. The features alone, because there's so much overlap, it's hard to really say that for sure. But things like the barrel markings, the gem markings, the markings here on the edge of the receiver, the fore-end tip and the half moon, things that are clearly used up prior to 1886, that helps narrow it down. But the other thing is the chamberings, the cartridge chamberings. Because, for an example, this is a rifle chambered in 25 rimfire, and just marked 25. Well, that cartridge didn't come out until around 1898. So I know that this rifle couldn't have been made before 1898. So that alone narrows it down to that decade following that. So by looking at Cartridges of the World and other resources to see when a cartridge was introduced, that's one of the things I use to help try to narrow down the dating. Because if a cartridge, a gun could have been manufactured prior to the introduction date of that cartridge, unless the rifle's been rebarreled or rechambered or something. So that's, I use that also. Let's talk about chambering markings. Remington was really, really bad about clearly marking what cartridges these rifles are chambered for. And it probably wasn't just Remington, other manufacturers were pretty lame about it too. But these are typically just marked with a number, like 32 or 44. And I'll show you one of these. Some of them are kind of hard to see. Let's see if I can get one that shows up well here. Now this one right here is marked 32 CTG. CTGE, I think. 32 cartridge. And that's one of the common markings. Can you get that here? Is that better? So you can see it there. But many of them are just marked with a 32 or a 40. Now this is a 38 CTGE. The very early ones have CTG on them, some of them, but not all. But then many of these others, let's see now. This is a 32, just plain old 32. It's all it says. So it doesn't tell you what 32 it is. This is a 44. Doesn't tell you much. Let me get it where I get it. Can you see that? I'm tilting it this way. There we go. There, you can see that. It just says 44. So yeah, that doesn't help you a lot, because there are a lot of different 32 caliber cartridges, 44 caliber cartridges. This is just marked 25. Well, this is 25 Stevens rimfire. Now, I'll tell you this, the 32s, and I've mentioned this in some of my other videos that you may have seen, the 32 rimfire is the most common chambering of all these rifles. It was extremely popular back in the 1800s. But just to show you how some of the confusion they had, the number 4 boys rifles, the smaller number 4 boys rifles, are just stamped 32 also. those are chambered for the 32 rimfire cartridge. But the number twos, which are stamped 32 also, the same stamping, I found, and I've examined a lot of these rifles, every one of them I examined is chambered for the 32 extra long cartridge. It's just a longer version of the 32 rimfire, but you wouldn't know it by looking at it. And I'm pretty confident that every number two that's stamped 32 is for the 32 extra long. Now I shoot almost all my rifles, and I make my own 32 reloadable rimfire extra long cartridges, and I make the centerfire one so I can shoot all my rifles. And it's really a great cartridge. It's very, very accurate. But they chambered rifles for a lot of different cartridges, but they're very vague. And now, part of my research project that some of you have participated in, I've sent out a survey and asked you to fill it out with your rifle serial number and identify all the features you had. And I get a lot of the cartridge markings are so vague that it's really hard to tell what some of these are actually chambered in. But I know that, I will tell you that that when they chambered it for a Winchester cartridge, either 3220, 3840, or 4440, which is pretty rare, they were marked 38W, 44W, or 32W for Winchester to differentiate those from a 32 rimfire. But there are also 38 centerfire cartridges that are basically, it's the rimfire version that just has the centerfire block, but the marking is still just 38 on them. So it's confusing, and that is really hard to identify what you have if it's just marked 38 or 44 or something. You really need to do a chamber cast to see what you've got. But if you got questions about it, feel free to reach out to me. I'm glad to try to help you out with it. So I think that's the overview I wanted to give you. These rifles are fascinating rifles. I really like this size. They're the mama bear of the rolling blocks. Not too big and not too small. They're just beautifully balanced. They're just really sweet rifles. And they were chambered in a lot of different cartridges. So I've got them anywhere. I have them from 22 up to 44 caliber and everywhere in between. And they're just a lot of fun to shoot. So I hope that helps you a little bit. This is an ongoing project. I continue to research them. If you have a rifle, a number two sporting rifle, and you have not participated in my research, please reach out to me. I will send you a survey. I have that survey posted on several of the different Facebook rolling block groups that I'm in, and also I'm on the ASSRA forum. I'd be glad to send you that survey, and you can fill it out, send it back to me, and add to my research database. So thanks for watching. I appreciate it. I hope that you find this useful. If you did, please like the video and subscribe to my channel, and I'll have more coming out soon. Thank you very much. Take care.